For almost 20 years, I was the pastor of a church in the Miami area. It was one of the most unusual churches in America. Sometimes on a Sunday morning, the leading prostitute at Caesar's Palace would be sitting next to the president of the women in the church, both of them knowing they were sinners and that they had found Christ. Sometimes Billy Graham would be sitting next to the maid who made up his room that morning in the hotel where he had stayed. There were a number of people who were gay and lesbian in various degrees of healing, some who had gotten straight and some who were still struggling but knew that Jesus loved them. People in that church didn't pretend much to be good because we knew we weren't, but we leaned heavily on the imputation of Christ's righteousness, and we rejoiced in the fact that God loved us. But they were an independent bunch. In fact, the downside of that kind of church is those kinds of people are very strong, very independent, and they're going to do as they please, and they didn't recognize the importance of pastoral authority. When they voted unanimously to become a part of this denomination, everybody was surprised. A friend of mine said, "Steve, that bunch wouldn't vote unanimously on the second coming of Christ." Ben Hayden, who had been a pastor in that church, laughed one time, told me what the local principal of the high school said about the church. He said, "Ben, those people are wild people." He said, "They come into my office, they're really angry, we talk about it, we settle it, they leave, and I find out it's not settled at all. It's not even close to being settled. You have a bunch of wild people in that church." You ever think that maybe God says that about us? I settled it 2,000 years ago, and you keep trying to do it over and over and over again. You don't have to be me, God says. Will you get that through your head? You don't think it's settled. You don't think it's ever settled. And thus the title of the sermon, It's Over. It's really over. If you have your Bibles, well, don't turn to this passage in John 19:30. Unless you're a Baptist and grew up on sword drills, you'll never find it before I get to it. We're going to spend most of our time in the 10th chapter of Hebrews. In the 19th chapter of John, in the 30th verse, Jesus is hanging spread eagle on crossbeams on the town garbage heap, and he's close to death. And his final words are these: "It's finished. It's finished." Now open your Bible to the 10th chapter of the book of Hebrews. And we don't know who wrote this book, by the way. We do know, if you're using the King James Version of 1611, it says the letter of Paul to the Hebrews, but we know for sure that Paul didn't write this letter. We don't know who wrote it. Somebody who was anonymous, somebody who loved Jesus enough not to use his or her name. In the 10th chapter of the book of Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews writes as follows: "For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Otherwise, would they not have ceased to be offered, since the worshipers, having once been cleansed, would no longer have any consciousness of sin? But these sacrifices, in them there is a reminder of sin every year. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins." And then he quotes from a messianic psalm. "Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, 'Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me, and burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure.' Then I said, 'Behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book.' When he had said the above, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings, these offered according to the law. Then he added, 'Behold, I have come to do your will.' He abolishes the first in order to establish the second. And by that will we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. For by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. This morning I want to talk to you about it being over, about the fact that it really is over, that it really is finished. But I want to go down one side road before we do that, and it's not entirely irrelevant to the other things that we're going to study this morning. I want you to note in this text as an illustration that whenever God does something, he prepares his people for doing it. And if he's going to do something really, really big, he really prepares his people. Somebody said to a Yankee friend, when you come to the South and a Bubba says, "Here, hold my beer and watch this run." Well, when God says, "I'm getting ready to do something, watch this, get out of the way because it's going to be really big." I'm going to give you a lesson in History 101. If you had lived 1800 years before the birth of Christ in the Middle East, you would have noticed a group of nobodies, Bedouins in the middle of the desert, and they would smell. The animals lived with them, and they moved with their animals. They were uneducated, they were unsophisticated, and then for no reason that anybody on the earth can possibly discern, these people said, "There is one God, and we are his people," and they developed the highest form of monotheistic, ethical religion the world has ever known. And nobody knows where in the world they got it. They were living in the midst of people who sacrificed their children. They were living in the midst of people who were educated and sophisticated. And these nobodies in the middle of nowhere developed this ethical monotheism that was philosophically as profound as anything that had been seen on the face of the earth. Where did they get it? I know of no better argument for the existence of God than the existence of the Jews. How many Babylonians do you know? The reason you don't know many Babylonians is because the Babylonians were not the people of God. Now, I want you to put that on the back burner. That corridor of human history began to move and flow. About 700 years before the birth of Christ, there was another corridor, another theme of human history. It was the Greco-Roman theme of human history. You remember Alexander and the Peloponnesian Wars and the division of the kingdom among the sons. The Greeks developed great architecture and great music and great philosophy. And then when the Romans came along, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, there was a common road system. There was a common language. There was a common coinage. And for the first time in all of human history, all of Western civilization could absorb an idea. You need to know that those two corridors of human history moved parallel to one another for almost 700 years, and at one time, in time, they crossed. And at the very moment they crossed, Jesus of Nazareth was born. If he had been born 40 years before, there would be no perimeter, and you never would have heard his name. If he had been born 40 years later, you would not be a Christian, for there would be no Christianity. And if you think that's an accident, you will believe anything. But there is more. God prepares before he acts, and he began to prepare the thought forms of the cultures to which his son would come. You need to know that the Greeks, the Stoics in particular, the Greeks and the Romans understood molecular physics before we did. They understood that nothing was solid, that things moved around in the context of the chair on which we are sitting. And then they said something sticks it together. Something holds the universe together. And do you know what they called it? They called it the Logos, the Word. And parallel to that, the Jews were developing their own concepts. If you read Proverbs and then read some of the other wisdom literature, you see wisdom personified. You see the word being spoken and becoming that which is spoken by the God of the universe. And in the intertestamental period, those concepts got refined. And they talked about the word, the Logos. And then John wrote his book. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And the scholars at the Greek university said, my, we understand. And the Jews said, oy vey, we understand too. And throughout culture, people began to grasp the idea of the bigness of a God who would enter time and space. But there's more. In every nation, in every culture, in every society, at its base, there is a sacrificial system, and there are no exceptions to that. It must be in our genes or emblazoned on our eyeballs, but human beings have known from the beginning of recorded time that without the shedding of blood, there can be no forgiveness of sins. And whether you're an aboriginal people, whether you are sophisticated people, that sacrifice idea is built into the very way that human beings think. And then that got narrowed in Israel, and people talked about a lamb, a perfect lamb sacrificed for the people. And then as you move into the New Testament and you read the 10th chapter of Hebrews, you begin to understand the Lamb of God, slain from the foundation of the earth. So when God does something, he prepares. And he did something big that was absolute and settled in the first century in the incarnation of Jesus Christ. In the 2nd chapter of Luke, you remember Jesus has gone to be bar mitzvahed. He's 12 years old. He's in the temple in Jerusalem. And then after the ceremony, the families that had gone up to Jerusalem decided to go back home. Joseph and Mary assumed that Jesus was with his friends because that's what 12-year-olds do. Mary said to Joseph, where's Jesus? With his friends, I guess. Why don't you go check? And so Mary goes and checks and said, he's not there. They panic. They head back to Jerusalem in the temple. And this 12-year-old kid is sitting with the teachers, and they're astounded and astonished. He's asking questions, and he's listening, and he's speaking truth. And Mary, the Jewish mother, and all mothers are Jewish mothers, said, get your posterior out here. And Jesus said, Mother, don't you know that I must be about my Father's business? And then you move into the 19th chapter of John, and the business is finished. Jesus says, it's over. The reason I came is accomplished. It is finished. It is really finished. I was a pastor for a lot of years, and I'm not anymore. And I'm glad for a lot of reasons. But let me tell you one of the major reasons. With what I do now, I can leave the seminary or my office at Key Life and have done everything that I meant to do that day. My desk is totally clean. Every call has been returned. Every task has been done. Every broadcast has been recorded. Every chapter of every book I intended to write is settled. And when I go home, I don't have to think about it. I don't have to obsess about it. I don't have to stay awake and worry about it. It's done. It's finished. It's over. When I was a pastor, and I did that for a long time, I never once experienced that. I didn't like the people at first, and then God put them on my heart, and I couldn't get them off my heart. I never left that I didn't think about their pain and their broken hearts. There were always people I needed to call. There were hospitals I needed to visit, prisons I needed to get into. There were people I needed to see and things that needed to be written and meetings that needed to be organized, and I never once in all those years left the church thinking I did what I was supposed to do today. That's why I admire your pastoral staff. And as you know, Randy is one of my heroes. Except don't let him go to Iran. Are you crazy? He'll get killed there. I know he's the senior pastor, but you say, Randy, don't do that anymore. because you're going to get killed. Steve is an old guy, and he said not to let you, and we're not going to let you go anymore to Iran. Go to Hawaii or the Fiji Islands or something. Randy never gets you off his heart. He's never finished. When Jesus left the world and went home, he said, it did it. My desk is clear. It's finished. It's settled. And God said, did you hear that? And you guys keep trying to do more than that which is already sufficient, the blood of God's own Son. Now, if you listen to what I'm going to teach you this morning, it'll change your life. This is not my idea. I didn't dream it up, but it is so cool, and it's so exciting, and so wonderful that when I teach it, I can hardly believe it. One of the reasons we get in trouble as Christians is because we don't understand the difference between petition and praise. In the 30th verse of that 19th chapter of John, Jesus said, it is finished. And then look, if you will, in the 14th verse of the 10th chapter of Hebrews. Listen to this. For by a single offering, he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. Since we're talking about my being a pastor, I was a pastor in the Boston area, a bunch of old folks in church, and they talked about young people, but they really didn't want them. And the only thing that even suggested that anybody in that church wanted anybody who was under 30 in the church was a basketball hoop that was rusting in the parking lot, and kids would come there sometimes and they would play. There was a board of trustees in that church, and the pastor was not invited to their board meetings. They had the money of the church, and that's where the power was. The elders did religion, and everybody knew that religion didn't count. And the pastor was never allowed to go to the board of trustees meeting. I'll never forget the time in the parking lot when the chairman of the board of trustees looked at the basketball hoop and he said, we're going to take that down. And I said, like fun, you're not. You are. He says, it's attracting riffraff. I said, you'll take that down over my dead body. And he turned and walked away from me. Now, I have an authority problem. I get mad at stop signs. So I followed him across the parking lot, yelling at him, telling him it'll be cold in a hot place for you. Take that basketball hoop down. You mouth stuff about young people. You don't give deek about young people. You wanted old people to die the way this church. And then I realized I'd followed him up two floors of stairs, and we had walked into the church parlor where the Board of Trustees meeting was going on. I realized when I had an attack of sanity where I was standing and before whom I was yelling, and I looked around and went, oops. Jack, wanting to make the best of a bad situation, said, I want you all to know that I've invited our pastor to our meeting this evening. I decided I'm already toast. I'm going to be fired, so I'm going to go out in a blaze of glory. And I said, no, Jack, you did not invite me. I'm the pastor of this church, and I want you to know that every time there is a board of trustees meeting, I'm going to be sitting in this chair, so you deal with it. And you're not taking that basketball hoop down, okay? And they didn't. And the reason I'm telling you this is because Jesus is sort of like that. In the liturgical services of the church, we have an invocation. Do you know what an invocation is? It's the place where we say, please come and join us. Jesus says, I'm the man. You do not invite me. I am here. I am the sovereign ruler, creator, and sustainer of all that is. You don't have to ask me to come. I'm here. It's the difference between petition, please come, and praise, we are so glad you are here. Do you know who Richard Dortch is? Richard Dortch was the sidekick for Jim Bakker. He was a superintendent in the Assemblies of God and a greatly respected man. Gray hair, people loved him, balanced, deep. And he went to Charlotte to join that ministry, and he brought credibility to the ministry. But incrementally, Richard began to sell his soul, and he ended up in prison. I had him on my television show, and I liked him a lot. And I'd ask him a question, and he would answer it. And then he would turn to the cameras, and he would say, I am so sorry. Would you forgive me? Then he'd go back, we'd do the interview. 3 minutes later, he just, out of the blue, turned to the cameras and said, I am so sorry. Will you forgive me? I thought, that is so cool. Until the fourth time he did it, he interrupted me, turned to the cameras and said, I am so sorry. Will you forgive me? I said, Richard, shut up. You're driving me nuts. We forgave you the first time. You are forgiven. You're acceptable. Christ loves you, and we do too. Could we get on with this interview? Do you ever think that God does that to us sometimes? Some of you have sins that you've confessed every day of your life for 10 years. For God's sake, stop it. Some of you are here this morning, and last night was not something you're proud of. And you said, Lord, could you forgive me if I go to church? For God's sake, stop it. Some of you are reaching out saying, God, please love me. I'll read the Bible more, and I'll be nicer, and I'll stay within the box, and I'll help people, and I'll get involved. Please love me. And God says, stop it. I loved you 2,000 years ago. First, I would have you notice that our lives stay the same because we don't understand the difference between petition and praise. And then secondly, we don't understand the difference between reality and religion. Look at the first verse of that 10th chapter. This is so good. For since the law has but a shadow of good things to come, instead of the true form of those realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. And then later he says that when they offer the sacrifice, the religious ritual reminds the people that they're dirty, that they're nobodies, that they deserve hell. That's what religion does to you. And they're preachers who will manipulate you because they know it does. I hate religion. Religion makes people crazy. Religion bends people, and it makes them sick and neurotic. Religion, and let me teach you something. I taught you History 101. Let me teach you Philosophy 101. If you ever read Plato, you've read the caveman myth. In the caveman myth, Plato talks about that if you were born in a cave and from infancy grew up there and only saw the shadows of the people who walked behind you between the fire and that wall, the shadows, you would come as you grew up to think that the shadows were the reality. But they are not the reality. Now, please note that the writer of Hebrews, using Platonic languages, and there's some scholars that say that he didn't, but he's a friend of mine, and he or she did, use Platonic categories to express a very important truth. Religion is a shadow. It is not the real thing. Plato would say this is not a book. He would say, this is a shadow of bookness which floats around in the atmosphere. And I'm grossly oversimplifying this, but I wouldn't understand it if I didn't. The chair you're sitting on isn't the real chair. It's a shadow of its chairness. It's a shadow of the reality, and the real chair is there somewhere. And we got the idea to create the shadow from the reality. And then the writer of Hebrews says, let me show you something that's important. All your religion, all your prayers, all your rituals, all your sacrifices, all the blood that's been shed, all of that stuff is just a shadow of a reality, and shadows cannot help you. And then he points to Jesus, the Lamb of God, who died for the sins of the people. Once, says the writer of Hebrews, far, says the writer of Hebrews, all. It's settled. Do you know the story about the little girl who was in an orphanage, and the head of the orphanage watched her leave the dorm? And she walked down the walkway to the wall that surrounded the orphanage, and there was a tree over the sidewalk. And she climbed up on the wall and put a note in the crook of the tree. And as soon as she got back in her room at the dorm, the head of the orphanage went down to the tree, reached up and took the folded note and opened it. And it read, "Whoever finds this, will somebody love me?" You don't have to write notes, and some of you have been writing them forever by being religious. God, would you love me? I'm doing really good. I memorized Westminster backwards. I can lecture on the 5 points. I'm involved in 8 ministries. I have memorized almost all of the book of Ephesians. I pray 2 hours every day. I'm tithing, and I'm now up to 15%. And would you please love me? Stop it. For God's sake, stop it. Don't stop doing good things. Do them for the right reasons, because you're filled with the joy of his love that is already a fact and has been settled for 2,000 years. Before God hung the stars, before he hollowed out the valleys and made the mountains, he knew your name, and he loved you, and he will never stop. Then, thirdly, I want you to see not only the difference between praise and petition, between reality and religion, I want you to notice, if you will, that your life changes when you recognize the difference between witness and war. Look at Hebrews 12 through 13, where the writer says, "But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins," and here it comes, sports fans, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. Are you glad the presidential election is over? Man, I am. I lost so many friends. I have a friend who teaches at Asbury Seminary in Orlando. We've been friends since we were boys. He's a Rhodes Scholar. He's brilliant. And I just assumed anybody who was brilliant would be a Republican, of course. Those of you who are Democrats, when Jesus comes, you'll know that he is, of course, a Republican. And so I just said to Bob Tuttle, I said, "Bob, you ready for the election?" He said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "I can hardly wait to vote for John Kerry." And I said, "What?" And I went ballistic, and I said things that you wouldn't believe that somebody who prefaces his name with a reverend would say. I said, "I can't believe that anybody with the brains of a peanut would vote for..." And I just went on and on and on. He just shut up, and he said, "Have it your way." And when the election was over, you know what I did? Well, I wrote him a note first, and then I called him, and I said, "Bob, I am so sorry. I don't know what's wrong with me. I must have been drunk. These words started coming out, and I demeaned you, and I demeaned what you thought." And then last week, I had lunch with a filmmaker in Orlando who's a Democrat. And we were enjoying lunch, discussing things. He said, "You know, Steve, our lunches are more pleasant now." I said, "What do you mean more pleasant?" He said, "Well, now the presidential election is over. You're not such a twit as you were before." You know, we're on a warfare footing in the church, aren't we? And they think of us as condemning and mean-spirited, standing up for Jesus and motherhood and apple pie. You don't have to do that. The book of Colossians says that Satan has been defeated, that he's a dragon and he's been slain and his tail still swishes, but it doesn't have any power. The Bible teaches that every battle you should ever have to face has already been fought and won, and it is settled. My latest book is one of the truly great works of Christendom. And I was at the CBA convention. You ought to go to one of those things. It's really not a very good book, but I need the money. And I don't get anything for it. It all goes to Key Life. But I went to the CBA, I think it was here in Atlanta, the Christian Booksellers Convention. Boy, it is massive. And I signed books, and I did the interviews and all this stuff, all your stuff. But it's just, you just walk into this convention center, you're blown away with banners hanging everywhere saying, "Save civilization, stand up for Christ." And I wanted to say, "No, I don't think so. I'm having too much trouble with myself. I don't believe I don't believe I want to save civilization anymore. Besides, as I understand it, civilization was saved 2,000 years ago. As I understand it, that this thing is already settled. As I understand it, Jesus has done the work that I don't have to do anymore. I read a review of a book this morning that suggests that Christianity, well, doesn't suggest, but proves that the Christian faith is the fastest growing religion in the world. And in 50 years, everybody in every place with a few holdouts will know the name of Christ. I knew that. I mean, that's what Jesus was doing. He was winning the battles that we don't have to fight anymore. I have a friend who says, you know, it's hard to have children when you're older. And I said, I know, it's physically difficult. And he said, no, I don't mean that. He said, the real hard part about having children when you're older is naming them. He said, every name you think of is somebody who ticked you off. And then he said, I'm down to Jethro and Nefertiti. You know what we're called to do? We don't have to win any battles. We don't have to be angry. We don't have to be right. We don't have to save civilization. We just got to show. We just got to show where the poor are. We got to show where the gays are. We got to show where the politicians are. We got to show in academia. We just got to be there. And they've got a God-shaped vacuum in their heart. And our reality will fill that with the God that we worship and before whom we dance. Quit saving civilization. Civilization doesn't need saving. Jesus did that 2,000 years ago. Quit trying to prove we're right. It's obvious we're right. And when you're right, you don't have to shout. Jesus settled the battle 2,000 years ago. And if we understood it, we would be winsome people of God. And then finally, it changes you once you learn the difference between praise and petition, between reality and religion, between witness and war, but also when you see the difference between joy and judgment. I'm going to move out of the text. Psalm 95, sing unto the Lord. It's everywhere in the Bible. Make a joyful noise to the rock of my salvation. That's what I do. I make a joyful noise unto the rock of my salvation. And I'm going to keep doing it. Because I can do it in the freedom, the understanding that it's settled. It's over. It's really over. I have 2 dogs. One is Thor. Thor is named after a pagan god and looks like one. He's bigger than most of you, and he's the most obedient German shepherd in America. I mean, if Thor were here, I would say, Thor, sit, and he would sit. I'd say, lie down and listen to my sermon. And he would listen better than some of you have. I say, Thor, come, he comes. I say, be quiet, he's quiet. I say, kill, he kills. I mean, this dog is so obedient, and he's got papers that go back to the King Shepherd of Prussia. I mean, this is some kind of dog, but he doesn't understand grace. He doesn't know how to have fun. He won't chase a Frisbee. I throw the Frisbee, and he said, what are you doing? That would not please you. I will sit here and be obedient to everything that you say. Now, let me tell you about my other dog. Her name is Annie. Annie is called Annie the orphan because my wife almost ran over when somebody dumped her out of their car on a dirt road where we lived. She took her to our vet, and the vet had to hold his nose to cut the fur off and said, Anna, anybody who abuses a dog this way doesn't deserve to have a dog. Well, I was in Los Angeles when all of this happened, and you need to know I like a man's dog. I don't like rugrats. And this little dog is ugly as sin, little, got a malocclusion, looks like a demon or something. It's this little thing. And Anna said when she picked me up at the airport, I was in Los Angeles, she said, I've got a surprise for you. And I don't like surprises. And I know when she says, I've got a surprise for you, I'm not going to like it. But I said, what? And she said, well, I'll show you when we get home. So we get home. She goes in the front door. I go in the garage door into the kitchen. And this little weenie of a dog is between me and Anna, and he's growling at me and barking, saying, "She saved me, don't you come near her." Now, when Thor growls and barks, you run. I mean, he's big. I mean, he can eat you. When Annie growls and barks, you just giggle. You say, "What are you going to do? You're going to destroy me? Are you going to eat me alive?" And then Anna said, Annie, he's with me. He's okay." And so she begins to wiggle herself. And when she gets groomed, they put a ribbon around her. And I swear this, she goes to everybody in the house and marches in front of them and saying, "Aren't I cute? Aren't I cute?" And sometimes she'll walk across the couch and jump over my head and land on the paper I'm reading and look up and say, "I'm wonderful and I'm yours." And I'll pick her up and I'll say, "Annie, you are so ugly. You are ugly on ugly." And my wife will say, "Yeah, but you love me a lot." Now, let me tell you about my dogs. I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and if you love Jesus, you would too. After I take a shower, first thing I do is I take my dogs out to do what dogs do. And Thor goes, does his business, comes down the street, goes up the driveway and up the walkway and sits down beside me, and we watch Annie. Thor goes, "Ugh." And Annie's prissy. She's got to get behind. She doesn't want you to look. She'll say, "Turn away." And you turn away, and then she decides it's time to chase lizards and bugs. And I'll say, "Annie, come here." And she'll say, "I'm looking for bugs. It's an important thing that I am doing. And I think I'm going to go down the street a little bit further and have a little bit of fun." And I'm yelling, "Annie, will you come here? I'm going to break your face." And Annie says, "You wouldn't break my face. You love me. Just be still." And, the neighbors don't like yelling at 4 o'clock in the morning for Annie to come. They think I've got a mistress by the name of Annie. They know. And finally, in her good time, when she finally decides to do it, she will come very slowly up the driveway, and then I open the door and they go in. Let me tell you about my dogs. I love Thor, but I delight in Annie. I love Thor, but I delight in Annie. When I think that I'm forgiven and that I'm free and that I'm loved and that it was settled 2,000 years ago, I'm sometimes like Annie. I don't do it right, but I know I'm loved, and it causes me to laugh at inappropriate places. If the worship team would come on out, I want to close with something I found in a book called Who Hid the Elephant, about magicians. I just read it a while ago, and it was a fun book. Do you know that Houdini, whenever he went into a city, would go and challenge the local law enforcement authorities to lock him up in their jail? And then they would go in the front room. He would break out of the jail cell. Sometimes he would break out of the building and come in the front door. And then it would be put in the papers, and he would have a big crowd at his show that evening. Throughout his whole career, nobody could keep him in a jail cell except once. In a small town in America, Houdini challenged the sheriff, and they locked him in the cell, and they waited for him in the outer office. An hour passed, and then 2 hours, and then 3 hours. And finally, Houdini's voice said, "Will somebody come in here and let me out of this place?" The sheriff went to the cell, reached for the door, and opened it. And that was when Houdini found that the reason he couldn't unlock it is because it was already unlocked. Now, if you listen to what I taught you this morning, you don't have to live in those prisons of guilt and depression and loneliness and anger. That cell door was unlocked 2,000 years ago. You think about that. I'm in.